Hello, I'm Ben Tuman, and welcome to Skipped History. I'm recording this video before the election, so no spoilers. Today's story is about author David Muzzy and his textbook, An American History. I read about him in America Revised by Frances Fitzgerald. Last time, we talked about Mildred Rutherford, the Confederate historian who inserted the racist mythology of the Lost Cause into textbooks. Mildred hated textbooks that vilified the South, and number one on her hit list was David Muzzy's An American History. It's little surprise why. Writing in 1911, Muzzy described the history of slavery as a sad picture of violence, greed, and stunted moral sense, which, yes, sounds like me at a breakfast buffet. So what else was in Muzzy's textbook? And were the students who read it in the North really better off? To answer that question, let's go back to the Revolutionary War, when, according to Muzzy, New Englanders like John and Sam Adams were the undisputed leaders of society. Born in 1870 in Massachusetts, Muzzy belonged to a group of New England intellectuals who fashioned themselves after men like the Adams, and felt that they should have similar power and prestige. But after the Civil War, as major corporations grew, things began to change for the New England gentlemen, and Muzzy was threatened by the rising influence of businessmen and the Republican politicians they often supported. The relationship between the two, Muzzy wrote, was highly injurious to our democratic ideals. Men are put into office for the favors they can procure for the business interests, which, to be fair, does also describe amphibious reptiles today, and did accurately describe politicians back then. There was widespread corruption after the Civil War, as seen, for example, in an 1872 scandal involving colossal bribery of Congress by the railroad industry. So Muzzy's sense of self-importance led him to some conclusions we might agree with. It also led him to conclusions we would disagree with. Do you remember Frederick Hoffman, the racist statistician we looked at in the first couple episodes of Skipped History, who said that black people were constrained by their inherently inferior moral nature? Well, that was a view shared by many intellectuals in the early 1900s, including David Muzzy. So yes, he described slavery as a sad picture of violence, greed, and stunted moral sense. But he didn't think black people had the capacity to rise above the lowest rungs of society. And he expressed that sentiment in his descriptions of Reconstruction, the brief period after the Civil War when black men received the right to vote. Conceding that Congress had the right to impose Negro suffrage on the South, it was nevertheless a most unwise thing to do, to reverse the relative position of the races, to stand the social pyramid on its apex, to set the ignorant, superstitious, gullible slave in power over his former master, thrust black people into positions of high political office which they had no idea how to fill, and, worse still, they could be counted on to vote the Republican ticket. Consequently, by the 1900s, the South was still, in many parts, a spectacle of anarchy, violence, and fraud, which, yes, also sounds like me at a breakfast buffet. Why was Muzzy so opposed to black people voting? Well, maybe because he was a white supremacist, and maybe because black men did vote in overwhelming numbers for Republicans, which further empowered the businessmen whose influence Muzzy was keen to displace. So, at the end of the day, although Confederate sympathizers hated Muzzy, his own mixture of racism and self-importance led him to disparage black people, and, like Mildred Rutherford, to glorify the KKK, whom he commended for forcing the black man back into the humble social position which he held before the war. And while the texts that Mildred inspired spread throughout the South, An American History simultaneously spread throughout the North, where from 1911 to the 1960s, a high percentage, if not a majority, of American school kids read history from this one book. Because it was an engaging, sometimes insightful text that confirmed a lot of white people's conceptions of race. An American History was a bestseller until the 1930s, sold well into the 1960s, and was still widely read in the 1970s. Put another way, two of the people most influential in the U.S. history textbook tradition, and by extension, the U.S. high school history tradition, were white supremacists. And Muzzy and Mildred gave students all they could eat at the racist history buffet for generations. And though it does seem like there's no limit to how far I'll take this analogy, I apologize. I just miss being able to get fruit and pancakes and cut people in the omelet line. Literally. There is a limit to how much bullshit students can stomach, and we need to look no further than New York for proof. Because it was here, not in the South, not at the March on Washington, where the largest protest of the civil rights era occurred, and it was directly tied to the racist textbooks used in school. Tune in next time to learn more about that bit of skipped history.